Before I start talking about the theories of translation, it would be better to know about theory building process. What exactly do we mean by theory building process, and what is this process? This process of theory building involves observation, concept formation, hypothesis construction, and verification. The very first thing, or the key word of this process, is observation. We start from observation. Before building a theory, we must observe the concrete or the problem that is there in front of us. And that observation leads us to concept formation. With the help of that observation, we form concepts, and then we form certain hypotheses. And these hypotheses are verified in the field. We try to see whether the theory that we are constructing goes along with the hypothesis or not, or whether this has been being validated or not. This may be applicable to any discipline. It is equally applicable to translation. So for translation, we form certain theories on the basis of observation, concept formation, hypothesis construction, and then we go for verification. And if it is verified, then we take it as a theory of translation. There are three things which are involved in a theory. The very first thing is description. The term description mainly talks about the function and goal of that particular discipline. What are the functions and what is the objective of that particular discipline is covered under description. Then we have identification. What techniques and strategies are utilized to achieve certain goal? Because any theory or any concept is to give an idea about that particular discipline. So the function, the technique utilized, or the strategies utilized is covered under identification. And then we have classification, because there may be different approaches to look at a reality, and these realities can be categorized in smaller segments. So this segmentation is also known as classification, where we divide a particular concept into different categories. This is, as I've been saying, that this is equally applicable to translation. Now the theories that has been generated in all these years can be categorized or can be segmented into smaller categories. Now the question arises, what are those categories and what exactly do we mean by segmentation or categorization? As we all know, the interest in translation has a very long history, and in all these years there are a number of theories which has been generated, which has come up. These theories can broadly be divided into two broader categories, in categories of traditional approach and linguistic approach. Traditional approach, again, is a wide term that we used for all those ways of looking at translation which are traditional, which do not have scientific approach. Now these traditional theories start from the days when Bible and other religious works were being translated. So this can be further divided into literary approach and hermeneutic approach. So traditional approach can be divided into literary approach and hermeneutic approach. We know that since the days of Plato and Aristotle, translation was the subject of philosophical reflection. Philosophers were very much interested in translation, and they theorized it in their own way. For them, translation was something different from what we see today, or from the approach that we adopt today. Now, lot of work has been done. The English translation tradition in its earliest manifestation draws on classical precedent, mainly on the classical Latin translation, primarily from the Greek, as well as on early Christian Latin translation from the scriptures, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Hebrew Bible, and from the Greek of the Gospels. Clear and forceful as were the Roman writers Cicero, Horace, and Quintilian, the most striking example perhaps is Cicero's famous work De Optimo Genere Oratorum. In this work, Cicero makes a case for free translation. Now, that very term free translation gives us some idea about the notion of free translation. Free translation is somewhat different from word-to-word translation. There was a concept where it was believed that translation should be loyal to the text itself, but it was Cicero who for the first time introduced the notion of free translation, which is somewhat different from the earlier ways of translating texts. Because most of these texts were religious in nature, so there was a notion of religious sanctity attached to these texts, and they were trying to be, most of these translators were trying to be very faithful to the original text. They never wanted to deviate from the original text. So they were sticking themselves to the original text. But it is a very challenging job, because if you are sticking to the original text, so sometimes there is a loss of information in this kind of translation. And keeping this in mind, Cicero came up with a new notion, and which is commonly known as free translation. In most of these literary theoreticians of translation were interested in impact and influence of form and content, and vice versa, right and duties of translator, place of source and target language in translation, and never-ending debate of free and literal translation. So these were the four areas mainly, because most of these theoreticians were mainly interested in these four. I repeat them again. Number one, impact and influence of form and content, and vice versa. Right and duties of translator, place of source and target language in translation, and never-ending debate of free and literal translation. As we were discussing, to be a translator, you need to be a bilingual. You cannot be a translator without knowing another language. So you must have a mastery over two languages to feel yourself comfortable as a translator. And this is what they were doing. So now when we start translating, now there are two things which are involved. The one is the text, the form, and the other is the message communicated through that particular form. So they were discussing the impact and influence of form and content. What kind of relationship do they have? What kind of relationship we find in between form and content? Literary theoreticians were mainly interested in these four things, that is the impact and influence of form and content, where they were mainly discussing the relationship between the form and content. A particular word used in a particular way in a particular text to convey a particular meaning. So now there are two things which are involved here. There is a meaning and a word. Now the word will be treated as a form, and the meaning that it conveys will be treated as the content. So what kind of impact do they have on each other? That was the issue which they were debating most of the time. So this was one of their very interesting topic or debate that they carried out during their discussion. Then the next topic that they have covered in most of their writings is about the right and duties of the translator. And this is mainly prescriptive in nature, in the sense that they gives a detailed account of do's and don'ts. This a translator should do, and this a translator should not do. That kind of approach they were adopting to give theoretical framework of translation. And as I said earlier also, a translator must be bilingual. That means he must have a command over source language and the target language. So they try to debate what should be the place of a source language and a target language in translation. For example, if someone is translating a text from German to English, now what would be the place of German in that particular translation? Whether he should pay more attention to German or he should pay more attention to English, in which is the target language. So that kind of relationship that we find in between the source language and the target language was a matter of interest for some of these theoreticians. And then the never-ending debate was about free and literal translation. As we were discussing just a few minutes back about free and literal translation, this was most of these from Plato to Aristotle, most of these theoreticians were interested in this debate, because for them free translation is somewhat different from literal translation. A literal translation is more like a word-to-word translation, but Cicero and some others were mainly interested in free translation, where they believe that the translation should communicate the idea presented in the source language text. In that way, they were somewhat different from others. Nevertheless, while the numerous defensive or aggressive prefaces by translators are indication of strong opposition to Ciceronian freedom, the sense for sense approach prevailed. Many of them were against the notion of free translation, but despite that that revolt against the Ciceronian concept of freedom, many of them adopted this approach while translating a text from a source language to the target language. Then we go to the next approach under traditional theories of translation, and that is hermeneutic. Now, the basic notion of hermeneutic translation was the assumption that the use of language is essentially creative. Now, this word creative carries a lot of meaning, is a very loaded term. When we are saying that a particular expression is creative, that means it carries a whole range of meaning. And they believe that these kind of expressions cannot be easily translated. To translate a creative expression, you need to know the meaning of the hidden meaning of that particular expression. In their approach, or the theories that hermeneutic the theories that has been designed under hermeneutic approach, what do you find is that they believed or they treated language as let's put it in another way. In this particular hermeneutic approach, language was treated, or the signs used in language was treated as creative. So they were of the opinion that these signs are full of creative energy. Now, if the signs are full of creative energy,